Hi, it's Nigel Foote from the Anglo-Indian Heritage Centre. I'm here with Dr. Richard Johnston. We're at his office at RMIT in Melbourne. Richard recently was interviewed by Paul Harris for his End of the Raaj documentary, and I'm catching up with Richard just to see how it went and his thoughts on the project. Hi Richard, nice to see you today.
Nigel.
So Paul came out and interviewed you here. What do you think of his project?
I think it's fabulous. It's an interesting notion, and I'd like to see how it is then told, how the story is told. Yeah. You know, I'm assuming it's a narrative, because that's what people want. They want a story, and I'd like to see how the story is told. You know, there's a lot of scope, because you're looking at a community that a lot of people don't know much about. I mean, even the community sometimes need to find out more about the community. Yeah. But there are very interesting aspects to this whole notion of an Anglo-Indian community, because some people would argue that one of the biggest problems for the Anglo-Indian community is the lack of a sense of community. In fact, that's what one of my points I made to Paul is, you know, one of the things that the Anglo-Indian community really lacks is a middle class that can then, you know, attract a whole lot of attention, be role models. So when you talk about leadership in like you're a classic example of a businessman, Anglo-Indian businessman. You know, I don't see enough examples of Anglo-Indian businessmen who are role models for other Anglo-Indians. You know, I mean, I grew up, and my role models were people who could dance and people who could sing and play guitar. And
I can associate with that.
And good hockey players, good
yes.
cricketers. And look, there's nothing wrong with that, except that that's the kind of thing I talked about. But you know, the other thing that I'd love to see in Paul's work is an element of critique that comes through, because the Anglo-Indian community have really lacked critique when they look at themselves. And I'm assuming it's the Anglo-Indian community looking at themselves.
Yeah. Look, I know you. I mean, you know, your interview is just one of several. So I know it's hard to give your perception of the entire project. But you know, I understand that Paul's going pretty much back to the conception of the community, and he's making a very historical record and documentary. And for me, I think that's exciting because, you know, I've read the stuff in Wikipedia on the internet, and I've read various books, but to actually see this as a DVD, I think would be great.
Sure. But however, let's also remember that history is history. I mean, let's not, you know, that famous quote, you can't reheat a souffle. You know, I mean, we can't kind of hanker back to McCluskey Ganj, for example.
Right. Yeah.
That's finished. McCluskey Ganj is finished, and Paul's got evidence that it's finished.
Yeah.
So where do we go? I mean, what is this evolving community that we call the Anglo-Indian community? Yeah, I'm really interested in that question. So history is important. We need to understand where we've come from, but we need to move. And I think there's a young Anglo-Indian community that we need to be attentive to, who are moving ahead, and we can't anchor them back, anchor them down by this kind of history, maybe. You know, I mean, histories are good. We need to evolve with our history. You know, we don't, and I hope this is what comes through in the story. You know, there is a young Anglo-Indian community that's moving ahead, and that's evolving. You know, we're talking about a world in many ways that's getting smaller. You know, globalization, the world. I mean, this whole technology thing. You know, this. I think a very exciting young Anglo-Indian community who are intermarrying and who are moving. And even the community in India, the current Anglo-Indian community in India, hope that their story is picked up too, because I believe that they've done a wonderful job, far better than my generation, of being a part of the Indian scene as it is today in 2010.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm very positive and enthusiastic about young Anglo-Indians, and I hope that's what's captured in Paul's story too.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the other thing, like all, you know, if this documentary gets people talking about the subject as you and I are now, then that's good in itself, I believe, because that way it encourages people to go out and explore their own, maybe their own ancestry a little deeper, or may enthuse some younger Anglo-Indians in the community to go on and do their own research and to look at the community with fresh eyes, if you like. And,
absolutely. And
I think that's exciting as well, is that to think that, you know, in say 10 years, somebody else makes a documentary about where the Anglo-Indian community is in 2020.
And
so
that's why it's so important, I think, that, and I hope that the story doesn't have a defining role. These are the Anglo-Indians. I think it needs to be an inclusive message about Anglo-Indians, you know, because let's face it, I mean, Anglo-Indian community, as far as I'm concerned, one of the important markers is that they do straddle several cultures. And in fact, one of the great, I believe, achievements of the Anglo-Indian community is to show, in a sense, be a model to people to live in several cultures and to bring cultures together. We need to really model this in the story that we tell, be inclusive, rather than being definitive about who is an Anglo-Indian.
And you know, I think that the opportunity that's presented to us with a body of work like this really will provoke people to maybe even reevaluate who they are, possibly.
Sure. I think it's full of possibilities, and Paul he's put, I mean, the impressive thing is he's put so much of his own resources into it.
Oh, amazing.
I've never seen anyone dedicated like that. Well, for you for that matter too, dedicated in that way of actually putting in and financially putting in too, which is fabulous. You know? So, and he's done a huge amount of work. So I'm really looking forward to.
Well, he's quite an earnest young man, and I can, you know, if you look at the expression on his face when you talk to him, when I interviewed him about his story, he really sets his mind to a task, and he really goes for it, which is very admirable.
Put your money where your mouth is. I mean, he's a great example of actually doing that. You know, and that's needs to be applauded.
All right, Richard. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you. Thanks.
I know that you're published as well yourself.
Well, yeah, that's a part of my bread and butter. You know?
Oh, that's great. So maybe we could get together again, and you could tell us your story as well. I'd love that. I think that's an exciting. Well, I think it's going to be a lot of fun to interview you about your life. So we'll look forward to that. So I'd like to thank Richard for his time today. I'm sure that when we do interview him and he gives us his own Anglo-Indian story, it's going to be a lot of fun, so keep a lookout for that. All right, thank you.